What I want to do in this series of talks is give you an overview of the feminine, going back to 25,000 years ago, or even 40,000, and then show you tomorrow what happened to the feminine in the last 4,000 years, and in the third talk bring it back to how we can recover it and what are the values that go with it. And in the last one on Thursday, I will go into alchemy, because that's where the masculine and feminine truly come together. And that was the only tradition, apart from Kabbalah, that kept the union, the sacred marriage of the two principles. So that's the overall scheme of the talks. So what I really want to show you in this particular talk is what the goddess meant to people of that time. A totally different understanding of life, a different perspective on life, something that we've completely lost. And if we can understand the supreme importance of recovering the values that are associated with the deep feminine at that time, bring them back into our time, then we will have done something for the world. So there are three great mysteries. The mystery of starry space, the mystery of nature, and the mystery of our own consciousness and its relationship with the deep ground of life. So over some 13 billion years, our physical body, the vehicle for our consciousness, has evolved out of the depths of the cosmos, out of the life of this planet, and out of our quite long experience, 2 million years at least, as humans on this planet. So all this is carried within us, it's carried within the cellular memory of our bodies, this ancient 13 billion years of memories. But one has to ask, what evolutionary intention has driven our emergence from cosmic and planetary life? And how can we attune our consciousness to this evolutionary intention and to the innate harmony of the cosmos? So today we'll explore the feminine archetype and the kind of consciousness that existed in the very early cultures over which the Great Mother, the earliest image of deity, presided. It's a consciousness that's still found in shamanic cultures today, and it's vitally important that we recover it now. And I'm showing you this beautiful crop circle. I think the most magnificent crop circle that's ever been shown in Wiltshire, it appeared. A place called Milk Hill. And in the space of a single night, it was created with 900 feet across, 409 individual circles, ranging in width from 4 to 70 feet. Huge it was. It had 6 arms, and each with 12 circles. And I think we could see it as a template for a new phase in our evolutionary journey. It's actually been called the new flower of life. Isn't it so beautiful? Incredible. Nobody could have created that in a single night. So now we're going to look at the great epochs in the evolution of consciousness and our emergence from nature. Because we need to understand the influences that have formed our view of ourselves, the great epochs or stages in the evolution of consciousness and our emergence from nature. So from 2 million to about 10,000 BC is the hunter-gatherer stage, when men and women shared equally in the survival practices, really, which kept the clan, or the little small group of people, alive. And this hunter-gatherer stage lasted at least until 50,000 BC and the emergence of Homo sapiens sapiens. From 10,000 BC we get the agrarian stage, the beginning of settled communities, the domestication of plants and animals, and the growth of population, because obviously in the first stage the population was tiny. But the minute people began to settle, population grew very rapidly. And when the settling began, this was the beginning of patriarchy and the male-dominated society. And it could be traced back to 10,000, although by 4,000 it was definitely established. So around 2500 BC, we hear about the rise of the warrior civilizations, expansion, conquest, exploration, discovery, and we have the formation of huge empires and the movement of the population to cities. People who were farmers moved into the cities. And so you've got a completely different social organization at that time. From 1700 AD, you have the rise of science, technology, and the industrial era. You have again much greater movement to cities, an increase in the speed of communication. That was an enormous change, particularly in European civilization. And then finally you had the electronic era and the digital revolution, huge cities again, and mass communications connecting everybody all over the world, which is again an extraordinary revolution. But at the same time you have accelerating industrial and population explosion, and you have our species dominating and exploiting the resources of the earth, and obviously you have the pollution that goes with it. It's just inevitable if we have such a huge population. So now moving on to the four main phases of belief. First of all, there was the Lunar Era, what I call the Lunar Era. And the deity of that time was the Great Mother, who really presided over the Paleolithic and Neolithic eras for at least 25,000 years, if not longer. And at this time, spirit is both transcendent and immanent in this world. There's no separation. It was just all one, as I'll come show you later on. The close relationship between the visible and invisible worlds is still found in shamanic societies today, but we've lost that in our modern culture. So then we have the Bronze Age, and later, with the worship of many gods and goddesses, who personified the hidden powers of the cosmos, and who are worshipped in India to this day. Then we have the Solar Era and the Iron Age from about 2500 BC, when we have the great father god of the three patriarchal religions and the separation of spirit and nature. This is where it comes, the separation, during this particular solar era. And we lose divine immanence, and we have the emphasis beginning on collective belief and holding people in a system of belief that if anybody strayed outside it, they were killed, really, just like heretics were killed or apostates today. Immanence means here in this world. Yeah, instead of being up there in the sky only, it's here in this world, present, as I'll show you later on. So then we have the age of scientific rationalism, which we're in now, from the mid-18th century. There is no transcendent dimension of reality. There's only material reality. This world is all there is. Nature serves man, and life is a competitive struggle for survival. This was a misinterpretation of Darwin, which has got deep into our culture. And the universe is without meaning or purpose. So in this talk, we're going to look at the first phase, the lunar phase of original participation, was ruled by the Great Mother. Now at that time, as I'll show you in another diagram, the little human self was, as it were, contained within the great being of the mother, just like a child is contained in the womb. And we'll come to the second phase tomorrow. But this lunar phase is all about participation in the life of nature and the cosmos. We weren't separate from the environment at all. We were absolutely part of it, feeling ourselves part of it. And that lasted from 50,000 BC at least until right into the modern era of 400 AD. So here we have the Great Mother as matrix and container. And that statue was found in Germany 3 or 4 years ago and dates to 40,000 BC. Just amazing. That's the earliest one we have. So as I said, the self was contained within the great cosmic womb, because it was a cosmic womb, of the mother. It's so different from the way we think now. It's difficult to enter into that consciousness. And here, I'm going to show this diagram from time to time as it changes. Here you have the no separation between the conscious mind and the deep realm of instinct, really, which I call the primordial soul after Jung. And this is what he meant by the collective unconscious. It was the whole experience of nature right from the beginning, the experience of ourselves long before we were human, the whole experience of planetary life, if you like, which is there in our cellular memory. So we have the collective memories and the primordial habits of the human and the animal and plant species carried within us. And all that is called lunar soul. And there's no separate conscious mind, as I said then. This very deep sense of relationship with nature and the cosmos, because we were so utterly dependent. There was no means of survival unless we knew the ways of nature and discovered the things that worked and the things that didn't work. So creation was sort of felt, really, gut instinct. Creation emerges from the womb of the Great Mother, who was worshipped as the ruler of the sky, the earth, and the invisible underworld. So there were three realms, which will come later on. I'm going to speak more about them. Life was experienced as an organic, living, and sacred whole, and all forms of life participated in the web of life that was the life of the Great Mother. The Milky Way, when they looked up at the sky, was seen as the passageway by which souls enter and leave this world. They saw it as a great thoroughfare for souls to come into the world and leave the world. And the shamanic journey into the other world was the spiritual experience throughout that time. And those two beautiful images, one on the left is the Venus of Lespugue, as she's called, or the goddess of Lespugue, and the one on the right is the goddess of Locelle, both found in the Dordogne, and both dating to 25,000 BC. Now the moon is immensely important at this time, and it was regarded as one of the supreme images of the Great Mother and also the later great goddesses of the Bronze Age. It was regarded as the unifying power of the mother of all. The moon governed the fecundity of women, the waters of the sea, and the phases of increase and decrease in the life of the crops. It was an enduring image both of renewal in time and also of a timeless totality, because it always returned. Because what was apparently lost with the waning and dark moon was always restored with the waxing moon. So duality, imaged as the waxing and waning moon, was contained within the totality. There was no oppositional thing that we have today, which you get in the solar age. It was all part of a whole. So following this train of thought, life and death were not perceived as opposites, but were seen as phases succeeding each other in a rhythm that was endless. So you were reborn continually. You didn't disappear forever, you were reborn, just like the plants each spring. So today, when we look up at the night sky, we're connected to the hundreds of generations of people who watch the circumpolar movement of the stars and the changing yet stable course of the moon. Over thousands of years, they observed the connection between the cyclical rhythm of the four phases of the moon's life and the rhythm of the four seasons of the earth itself. And they experienced the phases of their own lives, youth, maturity, aging, and death, as part of that rhythm of the greater life of the moon. So the constant return of the crescent moon after the 3 days of darkness laid the foundation for trust in the survival of the soul and hope in the renewal of life after apparent death. And this may have been the original inspiration for the belief in reincarnation, I think. This lunar pattern, constantly repeated through eons of time, connected us both to the cosmos and to the earth. It spoke to our imagination, giving rise to great myths which endured for thousands of years. And we began to perceive birth and death as rites of passage for the soul, as it journeyed between the visible and invisible dimensions of the Great Mother, a journey which followed a path through the Milky Way and the labyrinth of the stars. The ancestors were not lost to the living, but were close by, available through shamanic mediation to counsel and guide, and through mediumship that the ancestors did speak to the people, either in dreams or visions or actual manifestations. This happens still in shamanic cultures today. So in lunar culture, there was no final demarcation line between life and death. or between death and rebirth. The mythic theme of lunar culture is a cyclical process of birth, death, and regeneration. There was always regeneration after death because the moon always returned with a new crescent. So you can see how this deeply imprinted the psyche with this rhythm, if you like. And this belief arose from the age-old observation of the recurring phases of the moon. Its birth as a crescent, its waxing to fullness, and its waning into the 3 days of darkness. Over tens of thousands of years, shamanic rituals and myths kept alive the sense of connection between this world and the other invisible world, whose symbol initially may have been the mysterious dark phase of the moon. Out of that darkness, the crescent was continually reborn, symbolically associated with the regeneration of the Earth's life, and in India with cosmic cycles that lasted many thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, in fact. So the moon was the inspiration of the greatest myths and rituals of ancient cultures that were focused on the dying and resurrected god or goddess. The god died, or goddess died, but was always reborn, and that was tied into the regeneration of the earth each spring. So in Sumer, we had the famous myth of the descent of the goddess Inanna, which is a lunar myth. She shed all her wonderful jewels and garments and everything as she made her descent into the underworld. There she was hung on a hook by her sister goddess, Erishkigal, and she was rescued by the god Enki, who sent a messenger to bring her out and, after the 3 days, bring her up into the upper world again, and she ascended as the lunar goddess again. It's a most wonderful myth. So we also have the wonderful myth from Egypt of Isis's search for her husband Osiris, and I was telling Scylla about it last night, how he was cut into 14 pieces and how Isis went all over the land of Egypt picking up these pieces, including the penis, which was been swallowed, I think, by a fish, but was regurgitated. And then she mated, as a bird, she mated with the penis and gave birth to her son Horus out of that. It's a most amazing myth, a lunar myth again, the fading days of the moon and then the rebirth. Then in Babylonia, you had Ishtar's search for her son Tammuz, who went to sleep in the underworld, and she had to go down and wake him up every year and bring him back to life so that the earth was regenerated. Wonderful myth again. In Anatolia and Rome, you had the goddess Kybeles' search for her son Attis. Again, he'd been killed, I think, and descended into the underworld, but he rose again. And the people at that time used to put lettuces on little boats on the rivers as a symbol of the new life coming back in the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. There was a ritual every year. And finally, in Greece, we have Demeter's search for her daughter Persephone. And you all know the story, I'm sure, of how Persephone was snatched away into the underworld by Pluto, by Hades. And then her mother, Demeter, was so angry that she went to Zeus and said, "I will destroy the earth unless you bring me back my daughter." And so Zeus, thoroughly frightened, said, "Okay, you can have your daughter back, but you'll have to spend 6 months in the underworld," because she ate the pomegranate seeds. She stays in the underworld with Hades, and then in 6 months she can return to the world, and that's the rebirth of the earth in spring, when she ascends from the underworld. All these are wonderful myths, and they were acted over thousands of years. They were rituals that were supremely important to the people. So these very ancient and long-lasting lunar myths celebrated the regeneration of the earth in spring that was connected with the return of the young god or goddess from the underworld. But the later Christian myth of Christ's birth, death, and resurrection took the myth of death and regeneration to a new level, signifying the birth of a new era rather than the regeneration of the earth in spring. It was quite different. It took it to a new level. But it was no longer connected to the cycles of the earth's life, as the earlier myths were, although it was in a way, because the crucifixion of Christ, again, he dies and he's reborn, regenerated when he's resurrected. It's the same basic myth, but changed slightly in order to fit in with the Christian tradition. It's fascinating. If you read Fraser's Golden Bough, he's most interesting about it. And here's the Green Man. All over Europe, particularly in the great cathedrals, the image of the green man appears in ceiling bosses and in choir stalls and in the carvings at the top of columns. All these images are the work of the master builders of the Middle Ages, many of whom were familiar with alchemy and its secrets. All these images proclaim, I am the secret life of nature. Spirit is present in all you see, touch, and hear. The image of the green man goes back to the dying and resurrected gods of the Bronze Age, who personified the earth's regeneration in spring. And the influence of the green man continues into Greek mythology in the figure of Pan, the god of nature, greenness, and regeneration. And in the Middle Ages, this image conveys a secret message from the master builders of the cathedrals, the idea that spirit was present in nature. This is something I'd like you to remember, because I'm going to talk about it on Wednesday particularly, to show how fascinating this is coming back in science today. So what I want to really convey to you, that at this time the cosmos was perceived as a living being, the whole cosmos. In the Neolithic era and the great civilizations of the Bronze Age, particularly those of Egypt, India, and China, the whole cosmos was imagined as a living being, an organic, sacred, and living whole. And the world was seen as a showing forth of an unseen source or ground, which breathed it into being, animating and sustaining it. So everything was infused with divinity, because each and all were part of a living, breathing, connecting web of life, animated by spirit. People felt they lived within a sacred order, however difficult life was, and it was, because people died maybe by the age of 30 during most of this time. But they felt they lived within a sacred order, the triple order of the Great Mother, who ruled sky, earth, and underworld. And those three worlds were reflected in the triple spiral that was her signature, which will come up again later. Now, I've got a painting by Cecil Collins, who worked at Dartington during the war and had a lot of people here working together really to keep the spirit of the imagination and art alive. He was a very great artist, not appreciated by this country, I'm ashamed to say. I have many, many of his paintings and drawings because we knew him, my husband and I, and my husband studied with him at the Central School of Art, those of you who know English art schools. And he studied with him for 5 or 6 years. And this is one of his finest paintings that hangs in our bedroom, which is very nice. But you can see it just expresses this idea of the whole being contained, as it were, with the figure of the goddess, with the whole of nature being blessed, really, by her presence. And I'm sure he felt that very strongly at Dartington. Now I'd like to turn to specific images of the Great Mother associated with this ancient time and follow them through different cultures. So here are 3 images of her. The central one, as I said, was found recently in Germany, dating to 40,000 BC. The others were found in the Dordogne area of France and date to around 25,000 BC. Note the left-hand image and how her left hand rests on her belly, and her right holds the bison's horn in the shape of the crescent moon, making the association between the waxing life in the heavens and the growing life in her womb. This is something that Jules Cashford and I, when we wrote The Myth of the Goddess, were particularly struck by. Now, in this time in Western Europe, in the Paleolithic era, when the magnificent paintings we so admire were created, the cave was the most sacred place, the focus of the life of the tribe. They didn't live in the cave, they lived outside it, but they had their rituals inside the cave. Symbolically, the cave represented the womb of the Great Mother, the secret hidden source of her regenerative power. It was from such mysterious places as the cave and the later megalithic temple tomb and passage grave that she was believed to bring forth the living and receive the souls of the dead back into herself for regeneration and rebirth. The cave may always have been a place where incubation rites were practiced and the shamanic experience of death and rebirth evoked. The cave still symbolizes, in vision, dream, and mystical experience, the deep instinctual psychic level which gives access to revelation and communion with levels of consciousness beyond our normal range. People still seek out caves and places that have been held sacred for millennia to hold special rituals for healing and communion with an invisible world. Even now, as one retraces their path into the far recesses of a cave, awed and silenced by the weight of the darkness, if any of you have been in the cave with no light, you're absolutely pressured by the feeling of the darkness pressing in on every side. One can feel what the people of this ancient time felt. One is inside the womb of the Great Mother, in the utter stillness, the mystery of darkness, at the very heart of life. In the very furthest reach of the cave, in domed chambers, vast as a cathedral, but sometimes narrow passages also, people painted and carved the magnificent animals that we can see today. And here is a replica of the Chauvet cave that was discovered only about 10 years ago in France, in the Ardèche region. It's 36,000 years old, the actual paintings in it. Incredibly old. I mean, when you think we know about 4,000, 5,000 years, but 36,000, it really takes one back a bit. They've recreated a replica of part of the cave, not the whole of it because it was huge, with all the animals repainted on the walls. And if you ever have a chance to visit it, I would really recommend it, because it would be, particularly for children and teenagers, extraordinary experience. And the people who discovered this enormous cave said that they could feel the living presence and the spirit of these artists and felt themselves to be intruders when they slipped down the hole into the bottom, and they were absolutely astounded at the vastness of this place and also at the huge number of drawings that they found. So that was 20,000 years older than Lascaux, this is, and here is a bison from that period, and then up in the corner I've put a little snowy owl, which was one of the other drawings on the walls of the cave, going back to that ancient time. The animals, like the people who painted them, were one form of the teeming life of the Great Mother upon which human life depended. Now, the breaking of the divine order by the slaying of an animal required a ritual honoring the animal's spirit, so that it would consent to return to be hunted again, and therefore to ensure the survival of the tribe or clan. There were no vegetables at the time. It was in the Ice Age. There was nothing but animals and snow, so they had to depend on that. This necessitated a journey to the realm of spirit to request the return of the animal. This is still done in the Arctic and different places in Siberia, and they thank the animal who has been slain in order that it would return again. The painted images of these caves are so remarkable because they suggest a well-developed community surviving over tens of thousands of years, with a continuity of mythological beliefs and images and rituals, and advanced imaginative and technical skills to express them. Some of the paintings have 5,000 years between them. I find this tremendously exciting, and I hope you do too. This is a shaman from the cave at Lascaux, which has not been included in the replica, so you'll never see it, I'm afraid. I didn't see it either because it was 18 feet below the surface of the cave at Lascaux when I was a teenager. But this is what it actually looks like. This is a shaman from the cave at Lascaux showing him lying prone on the floor with his penis erect, flying like the bird perched on his staff to the invisible world. Shamans mediated between the two worlds of human experience, and their flight into darkness took place necessarily in the most secret part of the cave, where ordinary vision could be readily transcended. The artist and the shaman were probably one and the same. Through their magical power to recreate the animals on the walls of the temple caves, they connected the tribe with a source of life that animated both human and animal, becoming themselves vehicles of that source, creators of the living form like the source itself. They really participated in the creativity of the source when they were doing these wonderful paintings. Certain features in the landscape were experienced as a portal or a ladder that gave access to the invisible world of the spirits. This world could reveal itself in the strange shape of a rock, the flight of a bird, the stirring of the leaves of a tree, or the ripples on a lake, or the gushing of a spring from a fissure in a rock, as in this deep grotto in France, which I've been to, and it had a spiral pathway which you went down deep, deep, deep into a valley, about 5 miles walking down until you got to this fissure in the rock where water was gushing out of it. In other words, nature was held to be alive with spirit and able to communicate with man. Everything had meaning. Shamanic vision and ways of accessing the invisible dimension was passed orally from teacher to pupil for thousands of years. Shamans and later poets, artists, philosophers and musicians received their inspiration and their calling from the invisible world. The words spoken, the music heard, the dreams and visions seen came not from inside them, but from the soul of the cosmos, from the spirits of animals and trees and mountains and rivers, as well as from the ancestors who were never thought of as dead, but who formed a continuous line of connection with the living. At a heightened level of perception, the natural world was perceived as almost transparent to that other world, a theophany or showing forth of it. Everything was alive with spirit. I think you can feel that as you go around the gardens here. There is that feeling if you tune into it. I think fairy tales may be the residual fragments of that forgotten participatory experience, where forests were inhabited by creatures who could help or hinder, where spirits of tree and mountain, stream and sacred spring could speak to us, where bears or frogs or swans might be demonic beings in disguise, and where old women or old men living deep in the forest might offer us wise counsel, or birds bring us messages, warn us of dangers, and comfort us in bereavement and act as guides. And this still was going very strongly in the Middle Ages in Europe. People went into the forest to try and find an old man or a woman who would give them counsel and guidance on their path, whatever they were doing. And as one of my friends, who's now dead, said, these wise men and women were as ubiquitous as the birds in the trees, which I think they were everywhere really, and not just one or two places, but all over Europe and all over the world probably. So I'm going to show you now some images of the bird goddess, that is in her form as the sky, if you like, or ruling the sky. The bird as the messenger of the Great Mother is of huge importance from the Paleolithic era onwards. The first image shown here is the earliest known one of the bird form of the Great Mother. You can see the breasts and the elongated head, and there's even a sort of necklace round the neck. Note the stylized wings and the marks that suggest a necklace. The second image is 20,000 years later from northern Greece. The third on the left bottom is carved from alabaster and is from the area of the Dardanelles, one of the most beautiful images I've ever seen, I think. And the fourth is Aphrodite standing on her sacred bird, the goose or swan. The bird later became the recognized messenger of the goddess, as the swallow and the sea eagle were the messengers of Athena in the Odyssey. If any of you have read the Odyssey, you remember that. The dove became the image of the Holy Spirit in Christianity. And I've included a crop circle of swallows because the bird as messenger of the invisible world still holds great significance today. I know people who've had a bird such as an owl or a raven coming to warn them of the passing of a family member, and also after that member has been buried, they come to comfort, the owl comes to comfort the person and sits outside their window hooting. It's very moving, the stories that they can tell. So this kind of event and the connection between the bird and the Great Mother would have been noted for millennia. People would have passed it on from mother to child, that a bird will come and help you or rescue you or teach you. Very, very deep in the culture. So now I'm coming to something called Old Europe, and I've tried to indicate here the area that it covered. It covered Italy, Hungary, Romania, Greece, Bulgaria, and slightly into Russia, sort of Moldova, and right down into Sicily and Malta. So this was called by an archaeologist whose name was Marija Gimbutas, very well known in America, not so well here, I'm afraid.
Could you repeat her name?
Marija, M-A-R-I-J-A, Gimbutas, Gimbutas. She taught at the University of California. I think she was Lithuanian. Anyway, she excavated graves all over this area and discovered an unknown civilization that she called the civilization of Old Europe, dating from 7000 BC to about 3500. The Etruscans may have been the last descendants of that forgotten civilization. Gimbutas realized that the many different images she found represented the three dimensions of the Great Mother: the sky with her life-giving sun and rain, the earth with her life-giving crops and waters welling up from beneath the earth that were essential for the survival of animals, crops and people. Gimbutas wrote a wonderful book called The Language of the Goddess, which I would recommend to all of you. Do you know it? Yes? Which gave all the images of this whole period. Now, over 4,000 years, there is no evidence, she wrote this, over 4,000 years, there is no evidence of weapons or conflict in this extraordinary civilization, which vanished abruptly around 3,500 BC, possibly because it was destroyed by invaders coming into it from the area of the Black Sea. And I'd like to show you a few images from this wonderful civilization. Scylla and I saw an exhibition in Oxford about 4 years ago where these things were shown. And so here is a circle of enthroned female figures. We don't know whether they were priestesses presiding over some ancient ritual or whether they were goddesses. There's no one to tell us what they were. But they're extraordinary. They're not big, very tiny like that, weren't they, Scylla? Very, very small. Then I got to speak importantly about this because there are two of the most remarkable images of the Great Mother from the area of the Danube Valley. Now, the labyrinth and the spiral were, at this early time, symbols of the connecting pathway between this world and the cosmic dimension of the Great Mother's womb. So there was always this image of sometimes a spiral pathway, sometimes more of a labyrinthine structure like that. If you look at the right-hand figure, you will find traces of the bird-shaped head of older images and the necklace as well. I'd like to show you a few more images now. And that shows up later on, that idea of the labyrinth shows up on the labyrinth on the floor of Chartres Cathedral, which is what the central thing at the bottom is. And Scylla and I were there last year when I was giving these same lectures there to an American university called Ubiquity University. And that was a wonderful experience for both of us. So here is a figure of a woman, the front and the back, and see how exquisitely modelled that is. And they must have had the leisure to make these things. They couldn't have just sat down in the middle of the night and made them. They must have had time, which meant that they had a culture which they had enough to eat, and they were not attacked all the time by warriors trying to kill them or seize their things. So it lasted 3,500 years. And here are enormous vessels as big as this, huge and beautiful, with all these sort of spiral designs on them, curved designs. Now, moving on to Malta, which was also part of this civilization, they have some of the oldest surviving Neolithic temples on the island of Malta and also the island of Gozo, and the temples were laid out in the shape of a woman, really, with the breasts at the above and the hips. You can see that. Some temples have been discovered even submerged beneath the coastal waters, suggesting that Malta was once bigger than it is today. And the sleeping woman up on the right was found in a remarkable underground temple called the Hypogeum. They've just found one in Minorca about a month ago, the same. You go down and down and down into the bowels of the earth, and they think that it was where bodies were buried and where the rituals for the souls of the dead were performed. Very extraordinary place. And here we have Stonehenge. In the 3rd millennium BC in England and Ireland, there were also enormous stone temples built which connected the human community with the life of the earth and the cosmos, always both, the earth and the cosmos. Stonehenge is now thought to have been built as a temple for the dead. People carried the ashes of their dead relatives along a causeway and buried them within the Stonehenge precinct. They think that's the latest theory. And this extraordinary stone temple at Avebury went miles out, really. It was a serpent with two eggs in its belly, so to speak. And over to the far left, there was a burial place made of stones that you went into, and you took the bones of your dead and laid them in the womb of the goddess again. Drusilla was telling this morning. So the whole thing was really a celebration of the relationship between the earth and the cosmos. And these great stone causeways that they built were for rituals that would have celebrated the connection, probably at the winter solstice and the summer solstice and the spring equinox and the autumn equinox. Those would have been the great ceremonies that they had there. This was actually drawn by a man in 1725. Thank goodness he did draw it, because otherwise we had no idea that it would exist. And all that's left now is part of one of the tiny circles in the middle at the town of Avebury in Wiltshire. And this was another temple in Ireland called Newgrange Temple from around 2500 BC, and it was covered with white chalk so that in the moonlight it would have gleamed. Absolutely wonderful, I should think. Very big. Enormous amount of work went into these things, and again, people who were at war with other people could never have built them, never have had the time or the leisure or the safety to have built them. We know it would have been a temple of the Great Mother, as her triple lunar spiral is found carved on a huge stone, which I'll show you in a minute, in front of its entrance. There's the great stone with the triple spiral on it. The shaft above the stone in the left-hand picture is the opening where the first ray of the sun, entering at dawn at the winter solstice, streamed down a narrow passageway and lit up a stone at the far end. This magical dawn ritual, which is still performed to this day, people go to take part in it, signified the union of the sun with the earth and the renewal of the earth's fertility. So all these images tell us that at this time we were already well aware of two dimensions of experience, this earthly one and another invisible one, to which we were connected as by an umbilical cord. Mythology came into being in order to connect this world with that other one, and to create a sacred space where the connection with the eternal world would be kept alive and honored through rituals, through storytelling and the cultivation of the mythic imagination, which is something we've completely lost. All these connections and associations came into being through the ability of people to observe and to listen, and to make connections between what they saw and what they intuitively understood, what you were saying at lunch. All this was later contemptuously dismissed as by the so-called rational mind as superstition that we've thankfully outgrown. Rituals like those at the great temple of Eleusis in Greece, which had stood for over 3,000 years, strengthened the sense of participation in an unseen reality and gave initiates an experience of immortality. In a culture where visionary experience was validated, people encountered goddesses and gods in dream and vision. Birds were recognized as messengers of the invisible, very possibly because people dreamed about them in this role, or even heard them as a voice speaking inside them. Do any of you know Peter Kingsley's book, In the Dark Places of Wisdom? Well, he actually heard a raven's voice speaking inside him and warning of 9/11. That was a shamanic experience, and 3 days later it happened. So the raven actually came and sat in front of his table and cawed and cawed and cawed, and then he heard it as a voice inside, saying something terrible is going to happen. Amazing experience. Yeah, we know rites of incubation and healing were practiced in many sanctuaries. And we know from the temples of the god Asclepius in Greece that dreams and visions were of great importance in the diagnosis and healing of disease. Everything was connected, everything was sacred. The shaman healers who guided these cultures were trained to enter a state of utter stillness and to listen and observe what they heard and saw in an altered state of consciousness. They went into the caves to enter into this incubation state, may have stayed there for 2 or 3 days. So we carry within us a very ancient kind of consciousness that I have named lunar consciousness, and associated with the timeless wisdom of the soul. It's an instinctive, participatory, holistic, relational way of knowing, mediated through instinct, sensory observation, intuition, feeling, and it's still found alive in shamanic cultures today who are desperately calling out to us to wake up. Some of you may have been drawn towards recovering this lost intuitive and participating consciousness, bringing it to life again within you. Now I'm going through the images of the goddess who meant so much at this time, beginning here with this image of Inanna Ishtar, who was the great goddess of Sumer and Babylonia. And if you look very carefully, you'll see that 3 images above all are associated with the Great Mother and the Great Goddess. First of all, the bird, which we've spoken about. Secondly, the lion. And thirdly, the serpent. And each of those representing one of the 3 domains that she ruled over. So the lion was the earth domain, was her power. And the serpent was the waters under the earth. And it was associated with the regeneration of life because the serpent shed its skin and it would return in new form, so to speak. So it was associated with the rebirth of the soul after death, very much so, from the underworld. The serpent is in her crown. So there you have it. And you find that if you go to Mycenae, you'll find the Lion Gate. And if you go to Turkey, you'll find the goddess between 2 lions or leopards. So this was something that went right through the goddess cultures, the association with the lion or the leopard. Now going to Egypt, this is an image of the goddess as the tree of life, because in all the temples of the goddess there was always a tree, either a sycamore tree because it had a milky sap, or the olive tree, or various other ones, but the particular one in Egypt was really the goddess as the tree of life, and here she's giving the water of immortality to a man who is passing into the other world. It's just so eloquent and so simple to understand, really. Now this is Hathor, but also Isis, because they were interchangeable. Egypt has bequeathed to us one of the clearest images of this ancient worldview, as well as the incomparable knowledge of astronomy, geometry, mathematics, and engineering skills that supported it, and they transmitted to the Greeks later on, and later to the Persians. The mythological imagery associated with 2 great goddesses, Hathor and Isis, is of paramount importance for understanding the concept of the cosmos as a living, maternal unit entity. The whole cosmos was a feminine being, if you like. These goddesses were interchangeable, and both were imagined as the nurturing mother of the universe, and as the creative life impulse which flowed from the cosmic immensity of their being. It was they who endowed Pharaoh with the divine fiery power to rule Egypt, represented by the uraeus, or the cobra, that both the pharaoh and the goddess wore on their headdress. More specifically, Hathor was imagined as the Milky Way, whose milk nourished all life, yet she was always immanent or present within the forms of life, present in the statues that stood in her temples, and in the beautiful blue lotus that was daily laid at her feet. The particular blue lotus was sacred to her. Now this was the temple built to Hathor by a queen called Hatshepsut, who was one of the greatest rulers of Egypt. And this was what her temple once looked like. Today you'll only see the right-hand portion, is all that's left, but originally there was another portion with a pyramid on top of it. And it was tremendous. It was really dedicated to Hathor as the goddess of ruling over death, because the mountain behind was where she received the souls of the dead into her being, and from which they came forth. So that was the same understanding, but in Egypt in this form. And this is why in India and in Mesopotamia as well, the goddess was worshipped as a cow. It's the origin of the cow wandering through the streets of Delhi and everywhere and being sacred, that nobody would be fed and looked after. Because originally in India as well, the goddess took the form, or could take the form of a cow, one of her many forms. And here's an image of the goddess with Pharaoh, and they're both wearing the uraeus, as you see, in their crowns. And she gave him her power to rule Egypt. It came from her, from the divine source, so to speak. Here I must mention the ritual of the sacred marriage, which was the most important event of the year, both in Egypt and Mesopotamia. This marriage was celebrated in the magnificent temples along the Nile, and brought together the goddess and the king, or pharaoh, in a ritual of sexual union, probably enacted by priest and priestess in the temple. And the great barges went on the Nile, bringing the statue of the goddess to the temple of the god, and then the ritual was celebrated. But can you imagine the spectacle on the Nile with these boats going along it with wonderful carved figureheads and everything, and decorated magnificently? Because the Egyptians didn't stint on gold. Now, we also should mention the dark aspect of the goddess, and Sekhmet as the Lan aspect again of Hathor, was the goddess who could bring disease and flood and destruction. And so she was greatly feared, but at the same time she always brought healing and regeneration, and she carried a special thing, I can't remember its name, I should know it. Not an ankh, no, a sistrum with a special shape which could regenerate life after she'd destroyed it. So that you have there an aspect of the Egyptian goddess rather like Kali in India. She had this destructive aspect as well as the creative. And here's a beautiful picture of Isis as the bird goddess, keeping that going thousands of years earlier. She's got a throne on her head, which was her emblem or signature, really, because she was the throne on which Pharaoh sat. That's her role. Yeah, now here we have the goddess Nut, who is worshipped as the night sky, whose vast cosmic body was home to all the stars. When the Egyptians looked up at the night sky, they saw the body of this goddess sparkling with the light of the stars. The sun god died into her body on his nightly descent into the underworld and was reborn from her at the dawn of a new day. It's such marvelous mythology. Nut's image was painted on the inside of coffin lids and sometimes on the base as well, as if to enfold the soul entrusted to her care in her cosmic embrace. There is a moving inscription to her that I found long ago on a fragment of stone in the Louvre, and I will read it to you because it evokes her presence, and you can hear the legacy of the earlier Great Mother. O my mother Nut, stretch your wings over me. Let me become like the imperishable stars, like the indefatigable stars. O great being who is in the world of the dead, at whose feet is eternity, in whose hand is the always. O great divine beloved soul who is in the mysterious abyss, come to me. So beautiful. By the way, the inside, what she's embracing, is the netherworld, the underworld, or the cosmic otherworld, if you like. So she holds the whole of that in her embrace, as well as giving birth to the sun. And here, you'll find me speaking about this on Wednesday, because it's the basic pattern of life. And there is this academy in Hawaii that has put all this together and has realized that this ancient image from the Temple of Osiris at Abydos in Egypt, they knew that this was the basic pattern of life. Now, how did they know it? And we lost all that knowledge. But how did they build those enormous pyramids? They had some kind of technological mastery that we've lost and that helped them to build it. It wasn't built by thousands of slaves dragging those huge blocks. They never could have done it that way. And the carved blocks were shaped so precisely that they fitted with no space in whatsoever between them. I'm just saying that in passing. But I learnt that on the course that I did. So here is Artemis of Ephesus, who was one of the most important and widely worshipped great goddesses of the ancient world. Together with Isis, she was the greatest goddess. Only Isis was equal to her in stature and importance, and the worship of both goddesses lasted far into the Roman era and spread as far as Marseille in France. The main centre of her cult was Ephesus on the western coast of modern Turkey, but she was worshipped over the whole of ancient Anatolia, which is modern Turkey, as Cybele. Her statue stood at the far end of her magnificent temple in Ephesus that was destroyed in 356 BC, which I'll show you in a moment. Resting on her many breasts is the great lunar crescent. Can you see the great crescent? Identifying her as a moon goddess. And beneath it is a circle of tiny acorns. On her body are sculptured many different animals, including lions and bulls and stags and bees, as well as plants and angelic beings and priestesses of her temple. Her breasts signify boundless nourishment, for which she was worshipped as the nourisher of all life. Other sculptors of Artemis show her with the signs of the zodiac, showing her dimensions as a universal and cosmic goddess. And here is her great temple that was destroyed. It dates to the 6th century BC, and it was named as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It was 3 times larger than the Parthenon. How many of you have been to the Parthenon? Okay, can you imagine it 3 times larger than that? It had 127 fluted Ionic columns which rose 60 feet up into the air and were crowned with brightly painted capitals decorated with rosettes. The great columns were carved with mythological scenes, and the lintel was so heavy that the architect nearly committed suicide the night before it was to be erected because he thought it would never be lifted in place. But miraculously, the goddess raised the lintel overnight and it was in its destined position by morning, so he didn't have to commit suicide. It was destroyed by fire in 356 BC and another built in its place. And when St. Paul arrived in Ephesus to speak about the new order of Christianity, he was howled down by the worshippers of the goddess, who cried out in the great amphitheatre there, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians." And he was chased out of the city. They weren't having him. Then we have Demeter, who was the great goddess of Greece, or one of the great goddesses of Greece, whose great temple at Eleusis lasted for 3,000 years until it was destroyed on the orders of the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century AD. The secret rites of Eleusis that the Greek philosophers took part in must have put all who participated in them in touch with their deepest feelings of grief and hope, giving them a sense of trust in the survival of the soul and reunion with loved ones after death. The Eleusinian mysteries were one of the most powerful ancient rituals ever devised for keeping alive the sense of relationship with the divine feminine and the ground of life. And here we have Persephone, her daughter, who mainly ruled in southern Italy and Sicily. And the Greek philosopher Parmenides, living in southern Italy in the 5th century BC, south of Naples, describes his shamanic journey into the underworld, driving in a chariot drawn by mares and steered by young women. There the goddess Persephone takes his right hand in hers, telling him to transmit her teaching to the world of mortals. Parmenides was the teacher of Plato and had a great influence on his contemporaries, and a long line of shaman teachers whose names are recorded in stone in the town of Velia is now known to have descended from him. They were all healers, by the way, those people who were descended from him. This shamanic view of reality and the practice of incubation was most highly developed in Egypt and Western Turkey, from whence it was transmitted to the Greek philosophers. And here we have this magnificent statue of Athena from the earliest temple on the Acropolis. And you can see her robe is all bordered with serpents. Her crown is made of serpents as well. And she has a serpent staff usually. So I've done honour to the Greek philosophers here because they had a huge influence, mainly through Persia, because Persia took on the whole tradition of Greece and kept it alive, passed it on to the Arabs, and it then went round to Spain and came up through Spain into Europe in the 12th century. There's a long story which I can't go into. So there's Pythagoras with his marvellous theorems, his mathematics, Thales, who said the all is alive, Plato, who was the pupil of Parmenides, and Parmenides, who made that journey into the underworld. So to sum up the essence of this long lunar era, if we listen to the pre-Socratic philosophers of the 6th century BC, we find that they carry forward the legacy of the participatory experience of the Great Mother. Heraclitus suggests that the soul is of unfathomable depth. Thales of Miletus speaks of the all as being alive and full of daemons who are the agents of the one soul substance. Another one says that humanity and nature are fundamentally inseparable because they both participate in the same underlying substance which he calls soul. Pythagoras spent 40 years with the astronomer priests of Egypt and Babylon before he defined the mathematical laws which to him embodied the intelligence and wisdom and mathematical harmony of the cosmos, laws which eventually reached the builders of Chartres. And he left these words to encourage us: take heart, for the human race is divine. And finally, Plato, in his Timaeus, gave the name to the image of the all-embracing cosmic entity, which he described as a single living creature that encompasses all the living creatures that are within it. It is this Platonic understanding that the cosmos has a soul, and that this cosmic soul is the origin or ground of our own individual soul, our own consciousness, that we need to recover. But with Plato and Aristotle, we lose the ancient connection of the cosmos with the image of the Great Mother. Like that, it's gone. Chartres, to me, is the most sacred place in Europe, and I had the privilege of teaching there for an American university last July. It really is the last temple built in honor of the great goddess, Queen of Heaven. But it is also the shrine of a far more ancient goddess, represented by the Black Madonna, who is enthroned in the crypt. So the Black Madonna in the crypt there is the descendant of the Great Mother of an earlier age. She's a descendant of Artemis, Isis, and Cybele, all of whom were imaged as black because of their ancient connection with the moon. The statues of the Black Madonna all over Europe stand for the wisdom and power of the Great Mother as the great web of life, and as her power both to create and destroy, but also to regenerate. The mythology of the Great Mother and the great goddesses of the ancient world gave expression to the indissoluble relationship, even the identity that exists between part and whole, and between visible and invisible in all orders of being. Above all, it gave emphasis to the wonder and delight of life, because it included all manifestations of life within the sphere of the divine. There was nothing that was outside the divine. So if we're to reconnect with the deep or sacred feminine, we need to remember Jung's words: nothing to which the psyche belongs or which is part of the psyche is ever lost. To live fully, we have to reach down and bring back to life the deepest levels of the psyche from which our present consciousness has evolved. It's all there within us. So very quickly now, I'm going to just image this. I will come back to this in another talk, so I'm just going to show you this idea of the whole connection of everything. And finally, all the images of the Great Mother coming together. All these are images of what's called the archetypal feminine, of the feminine principle, which has been so long in existence, really. So we have all the ones that I've shown you: the moon, the mother, the sea. The sea is very important. I haven't been able to really go into that. Water, serpent, great web of life. The heart, the Grail comes out of this, all the Grail legends, and the search for the Grail is the quest for what was lost. And so we have the dove, the rose, and the lily, which I'll come to in alchemy. and finally the triple spiral and the labyrinth. And the vase or vessel right the way through was always a symbol of her body, the vase. So finally, to end, I've just brought this crop circle again, which is called the new flower of life. And what I hope I've conveyed to you in this first talk is the continuity of images of the sacred or deep feminine over these 25,000 years. Images that are found in the East as well as the West, because if you go to India, you'll find many of them there. They kept alive the sense that everything was connected and everything was sacred, because it had emerged from the womb of the Great Mother or Great Goddess. The principal feature of this time was a sense of relationship or kinship with all creation. And we are not outside or separate from the created order or from the life of the cosmos. Today, in the extraordinary phenomenon of crop circles, it seems as if we're being asked to reconnect with the earth and the cosmos, to see the earth once again as sacred, to pay attention to the divine order that we live within. Thank you.